Welcome to the Grid Services Valuation Model Training. My name is Stephanie Kinzer. I am a senior consultant at Energy and Environmental Economics. E3 is supporting Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, the Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources, the Massachusetts Attorney General's Office, National Grid, Eversource, and Unitil to determine an initial approach for valuing services that distributed energy resources, or DERs, can provide to the distribution grid at specific times and in specific locations. We call this work the Grid Services Study. As a part of this work, we developed a valuation framework and calculator tool. Today's training will walk through this valuation calculator tool. The goal of this recording is to provide an overview and a how-to guide so that interested stakeholders can understand how these valuation tools work. After viewing this recording and accessing the framework and calculator, stakeholders will ideally, 1, have a shared understanding of how the value of DERs can be calculated, and 2, understand that the valuation helps to inform how much compensation DER participants might receive as part of a grid services offering. Before we dive in further, it is critical to understand that outputs of this tool do not guarantee specific values or payments to be made, but are instead meant to offer example scenarios. Ultimately, grid services values are location-specific and will be determined on a case-by-case basis by the utilities. We'll start with the cover sheet of the Excel workbook. The cover sheet includes brief instructions, a table of contents, and cell style legend. The table of contents section provides an overview of the tabs included in the workbook. I'll walk through each of these tabs, but first I will provide an overview as described here. The first tab depicts the valuation framework, which illustrates the overall framework for valuing the benefit of DERs at grid-constrained locations and how each value stream flows into the grid services offerings compensation. The dashboard tab is where to start to jump into the model. It includes user inputs for the valuation calculations and provides an example of how compensation based on the valuation calculations may be determined and structured. The next set of tabs in blue correspond to each of the valuation calculations. The first sheet is a deferral calculation, which calculates the value of delaying investments. Next is the bridge to wires calculation, which values using DERs to temporarily address capacity constraints while a traditional infrastructure project is being built. The EJ impacts calculation tab calculates the values that inform compensation adders specific to environmental justice communities, including an adder to encourage EJ participation and an air quality adder to value the benefits of reducing air pollution in EJ designated communities. These last set of tabs in brown provide inputs to the calculations and are provided as reference. There are no user inputs on these tabs. The ICE Calculator Results tab are results from the DOE's Interruptible Cost Estimate Calculator that feeds into the Bridge to Wires calculation. The Reference Utility Data reports utility data that is applied in the valuation calculations. And finally, the Mappings tab provides drop-down inputs that are used throughout the workbook. We will walk through the blue and green tabs in detail as part of this training. The brown tabs are solely there for your reference. Finally, the cell style legend provides a guide for what cells mean throughout the workbook. Most importantly for users, the yellow cells are direct user inputs and the orange cells are drop-down user selections. So these two types of cells are styles that users should be interfacing with. The other cell colors are there to indicate how they inform calculations, but are not to be modified. This tab illustrates the valuation framework for the grid services offerings and helps to explain the model flow. Overall, our goal is to determine how much to compensate DERs for the value they provide to specific grid-constrained locations. Zooming in, I'll walk through our framework. DERs provide value in two capacity constraint scenarios, a deferral scenario and a bridge-to-wire scenario. I'll describe each of these in more detail as we walk through the model. To quantify the value of DERs in each of these scenarios, we consider rate impact and non-rate impact value streams. Rate impact value streams directly impact a utility's revenue requirement. So if we reduce the revenue requirement, we reduce rates that customers pay. Non-rate impact value streams also provide meaningful benefits, but don't affect a utility's revenue requirement. If we include non-rate impacts in the compensation, then we may inadvertently increase rates for customers that don't have DERs, creating a cost shift between those participating in grid services offerings and non-participants. DER compensation is primarily informed by rate impact value streams to ensure that grid services offerings support affordability. But non-rate impacts are still important and may help us meet policy goals. For example, we do recommend including the EJ participant adder and air quality adder in a compensation framework to improve equity. As we step through the model, we'll discuss each of the value streams in this framework. I'll also note that there are other value streams that we don't include in this model, but they may be included in the future when there is better data and improved quantification methods. One of those other value streams is the optionality value. This value reflects an additional benefit of deferring investments to reduce planning uncertainty. By waiting to make an investment, the EDCs will have time to reassess conditions, adjust their forecasted needs, and embrace any new tech advancements before they commit to a large-scale investment that could potentially be right-sized or reprioritized. Because we don't have the data available to reliably value optionality, the value is not built into this model. But if you are interested, we do discuss it in the grid services study, and we developed a generic methodology in a supplementary model specific to optionality. Moving into the model, we'll start with the dashboard, this tab, and focus our attention at the top on the valuation user inputs. We'll return at the end to this example of grid services compensation with its own specific user inputs and a grid services compensation calculation. For now, I'll zoom in so we can focus again on the valuation user inputs. These user inputs apply to all value streams. More specific inputs to each value stream are provided on their respective tabs. As a reminder, the yellow cells here are editable by users. Before we start discussing the individual inputs, I want to note that we don't expect all users to be familiar with each of the inputs to the model or to have a good sense for reasonable project assumptions. To guide the users, we provide default inputs to illustrate the overall methodology that EDCs may use. Users can play around with the inputs to see how it affects the final results, but keep in mind that the EDCs will ultimately look at specific locations at different points in time to determine the appropriate inputs. So, even the default inputs included in this workbook will not be used to calculate the value for an actual grid location or grid services offering. With that in mind, the first input here is the in-service date of the planned upgrade, the date when a traditional asset would be needed if DERs aren't available to defer or meet the system need. The next input, the adjusted plant and service year, is where the user can provide the year that a traditional asset would be needed if DERs are available to defer an investment. The model assumes that the asset will be operational by January 1st of that year. The years of deferral automatically calculates from these two inputs. It's the difference between the adjusted and previous in-service date. The second main input is to define the capacity need for load relief in megawatts. This should reflect the forecasted DER capacity need for a deferral or bridge to wires project. For our example, this location will need 1.4 megawatts by 2032, 4.8 megawatts by 2033, and 8.3 megawatts by 2034. So with these example inputs in place, we can explore the valuation calculations. But before we do that, I also want to point out on the dashboard tab, we also have example compensation user inputs and calculations. We'll come back to this since this takes all the valuation calculation outputs and gives us our end result for the grid services offering. For now, we'll move on to the value streams and come back to the dashboard at the end. Now we'll dive into the deferral value. At the top, we provide a diagram to help explain the deferral value. The later sections include the deferral value calculation with specific project inputs and the full calculations here. Returning to the diagram, I'll zoom in. Overall, the deferral value reflects the benefits of delaying an asset investment based on the time value of money. In this example, the blue line intersects the orange existing substation capacity line here, right here, showing that the anticipated demand exceeds substation capacity at this point. Traditionally, this situation would trigger upgrading the substation to increased capacity. However, if DERs provide flexible capacity downstream from this substation, they reduce the peak load to the green line, delaying the point at which anticipated demand exceeds substation capacity by several years, now to year Y. By delaying the investment, savings emerge, creating value for the utility and ratepayers. The next section is for the deferral value inputs, this section here. However, before stepping through these inputs, I'm going to first scroll down and explain the calculations. This explanation will provide context for each of the user inputs that we'll see above that feed into the calculations. As I said before, it's important to note that all inputs and calculations are illustrative. The example we provide intends to indicate calculation methodology rather than actual deferral value inputs and results. The EDCs will calculate the deferral value, and the actual approach applied by each EDC may vary slightly. So stepping into the calculations, we base the deferral value on the discounted value of the deferred investment. We can compare a scenario without a deferral, 0 years of deferral, to a scenario with some number of years of deferral, basically all of these other scenarios. Each of the years of deferral represents a different scenario. In the dashboard, I selected 3 years of deferral, so I will focus our attention primarily on year 3. Going back to our base scenario for the original investment that would have occurred in year 0, first we calculate the revenue requirement. Then we calculate the revenue requirement for all the other years in which a deferral would occur. So this row, 66, is the revenue requirement for year 0, and all of the rows below calculate the revenue requirement for the other scenarios. The revenue requirement is the amount of money that a utility collects from customers to pay back its cost and earn a reasonable return. This amount includes upfront costs, the depreciation of the investment, and cost of capital or discount rate. And these are all inputs that I'll go through in that input section above. So the revenue requirement calculations extend from the year 2025 all the way through the year 2080 to this column BK. After calculating the revenue requirement for each year, of the investment, we calculate the net present value of the revenue requirement in column C. The total deferral value in column D is equal to the net present value of the original investment's revenue requirement, so what you see in cell C66, minus the NPV of the deferred investment's revenue requirement. So for year 3, we take this original deferral value of around $76.5 million and subtract it from year 3's NPV of revenue requirement of about $72.3 million for a deferral value of approximately $4.3 million. The total deferral value is then translated into a unitized deferral value on a dollar per kilowatt year basis by dividing the total deferral value by the number of deferral years, 3 in this case, and the capacity needed to defer the asset investment. This is based on the capacity need input specified on the dashboard tab. In our scenario of deferring an investment 3 years, the total deferral value is about $4 million, and when we divide that by 8.3 and 3 years, the unitized deferral value is $172 per kilowatt year. Each year the investment is deferred leads to value until the existing asset reaches the end of its useful life. So that's what is shown here in years of deferral 23 and 24. At the point when the asset reaches the end of its useful life in this year 23, the existing asset must be replaced due to age or deterioration, regardless of whether incremental capacity is deferred. Because there is no longer the opportunity to defer the investment, the value drops to 0. We'll now review the specific inputs to this calculation in the Deferral Value Inputs tab. I'll step through each one and how it feeds into the calculation. To start, we allow the user, by using this drop-down, to select from 3 different capital cost values, example 1, 2, and 3, where you can see the capital cost amounts here. And these represent how the cost to upgrade assets may differ based on the location or situation in Massachusetts. As I said earlier, these example costs are generic, so they don't necessarily resemble an actual scenario that would arise. The user can also choose to enter their own capital cost here in the yellow cell if they prefer to override the examples and model another scenario instead. The capital cost value is going to be the primary driver of the deferral value. The capital cost depreciates over time in the revenue requirement calculation that we went over below. The useful life is the number of years that asset is expected to last. The default in the model is 40 years, which represents the average life of utility equipment. But a user can enter their own useful life in column D. The useful life determines the year of equipment replacement, as well as informs the depreciation. The straight line depreciation rate is calculated as the capital cost divided by the useful life, determining how much the asset depreciates each year and how much of the asset's value is still on the books in the revenue requirement calculation. Along with the depreciation rate, the annual revenue requirement percent allocator is an input to the revenue requirement calculation, which ultimately informs the cost that utilities recover from ratepayers each year. The distribution line loss factor reflects the share of energy that is normally lost as electricity is transmitted over the distribution lines to a customer. Because the DER is situated closer to or at a customer premise, this energy is saved. The nominal escalation rate also feeds into the revenue requirement calculation. It reflects how infrastructure costs may increase over time if the investment is deferred. The discount rate is the utility's weighted average cost of capital, essentially the cost to finance an investment, which informs the net present value calculation. The in-service date of plant upgrade, adjusted plant and service year, and years of deferral are all pulled from the dashboard inputs, so there is no user input here. The original asset install year is set to 2015, but users can override this input. Adding the useful life, which was this input up here, to the original asset install year calculates the year of existing equipment replacement, basically the year until which the asset can be deferred. And from this, we also calculate the max number of deferral years until the asset would need to be replaced regardless of the presence of DERs. Based on the selected inputs, the green boxes here show the outputs for the selected number of deferral years, in this case, 3 years. This pulls the results from the tables that we talked through below so that the user can easily see the total deferral value and the unitized deferral value for their selected number of deferral years. That wraps up the deferral value inputs and calculations. We encourage you to explore the model more, to read through these detailed explanations on the right, to look through the formulas, and to play with different inputs to see how it impacts the deferral value. With that, we'll move to the bridge to wires calculation. A bridge to wires DER solution is a scenario where the EDC identifies a distribution grid need, but can't build an upgrade for the asset fast enough to avoid the capacity constraint. This tab includes a diagram of the bridge to wire solution, the summary of our calculations, and individual calculations for the rate impact value streams for a diesel generator and backup energy storage, as well as non-rate impact value streams for the value of lost load. Before stepping into the calculations, I'll zoom in. To start with the example illustrated here, the EDC forecasts a capacity shortfall in the year Y, but the lead time to put that asset in place is so long that even if the EDC started planning and construction today, the upgrade wouldn't be completed until year Z, after there is already a capacity shortage. To address this, the DERs could fill in for the capacity shortage. If that capacity shortfall is not filled, then the EDC faces the risk of an outage or must provide backup capacity in the form of a generator or battery storage. To value bridge-to-wire solutions, we consider each of these possibilities and determine the value of these alternate solutions. Avoided backup diesel generation, or avoided battery storage. This tab includes calculations for both of these avoided costs, as well as for the value of lost load in the instance where no solution would be deployed and the system were to experience an outage. I want to note that an outage scenario is a worst case scenario and not an outcome that the EDCs accept or anticipate. We show an outage scenario in order to illustrate how the impact could be quantified. As a reminder, this scenario is a non-rate impact and one that is not included in compensation. On the other hand, the avoided diesel generator or storage backup are common alternatives deployed by EDCs and ones which would impact rates due to the cost of deploying and operating the equipment. This first section sums up the bridge to wires value stream calculations. I'll return to this after we walk through the individual calculations below. We'll start with the avoided cost of diesel generator backup power. Based on the cost provided by the EDCs, we provide a high, medium, and low cost example for calculating the avoided cost of backup diesel generation. The cost differences reflect the cost to roll out generation in different geographies. For example, providing diesel generation on one of the islands may be represented by the high cost value. The key inputs are the expenses to rent the generator and the associated fuel cost. The generator rental cost includes setup and breakdown cost, and this total cost is based on the backup generator size. The fuel cost will scale with the days of usage per year. We assume for our default that the generator is run 240 hours per year, or 8 hours per every 30 days. This assumption may be an unusually long time for a real-world scenario, but is simply intended to illustrate how EDCs may operate backup resources to reduce strain on the system during the hottest days of the year. In these examples, only the low example reports fuel costs separately based on the data that we received from the EDCs. The rental and fuel costs sum to the annual operating expenses, and then by dividing the annual expenses by the generator size, we calculate an annualized marginal cost on a dollar per kilowatt basis. In the medium example, this would be $100 per kilowatt year. Next, we'll turn to the avoided cost of backup energy storage. This calculation is very similar to the avoided diesel backup generation. Key inputs are again the operating expenses, which includes the rental cost and the electricity cost. The rental cost here is taking the annual rental cost divided by the backup storage size to get it unitized on a dollar per kilowatt basis. Similarly, the fuel costs are based on 8 hours of usage per day for 30 days. We assume a round-trip efficiency of 85% for the batteries and an electricity price of 4 cents per kilowatt hour, which is an assumed average off-peak wholesale price of electricity for the summer months. We multiply these and divide it by the battery round-trip efficiency to get an electricity cost of $10.45 per kilowatt. The rental cost and electricity cost are then summed for a backup capacity annualized marginal cost of approximately $220 per kilowatt year. For the rate impact avoided backup solutions, we weight these based on inputs that I'll return to at the top to calculate a weighted average bridge-to-wire solution value. For the non-rate impact value stream, we calculate the value of lost load. This valuation pulls from the DOE's interruption cost estimate, or ICE calculator, which is referenced in a later tab in this workbook. The key inputs to this calculator are the customer counts and reliability metrics. These are not active user inputs, but predetermined based on the economic risk profile for customers served by the bridge-to-wires asset. Basically, the overall value customers are expected to place on avoiding an outage. The value of lost load customer risk profile is an input at the top of the tab. The reliability metrics are also inputs to the ICE calculator and are set to reflect an outage occurring 12 hours, 1 day per year, which is an assumption based on how long an outage would last due to a peak capacity constraint. Both the customer counts and reliability metrics are entered into the ICE calculator and the results are run. The full set of results can be viewed on the ICE calculator results tab, one of the brown tabs at the bottom. The results for the selected customer risk profile, which again is an input at the top, are pulled into the ICE calculator results. Finally, the value of lost load corresponds to the cost per average kilowatt from the ICE calculator, which in this case is $69 per kilowatt year. Returning to the top of the tab, I'll review the user selections that inform each of the calculations we just went through. First, for the rate impact value stream, the user can select whether they would like the value to be based on a weighted average of diesel backup generation and battery storage, or one of the two. The user then selects an equipment cost example based on the cost of rolling out a solution in a particular location, as I explained while going over the avoided cost of diesel generation. For battery storage, we also use this input to apply a multiplier to reflect the cost premiums of a location. The high multiplier is 200% of the base cost, medium is 125%, and the low multiplier is 75% of the base cost. These multipliers are based on a typical magnitude of cost impacts from procuring and operating backup storage in different parts of the state. So the equipment cost range applies to both the backup resource calculations, just with a different set of numbers. For the value of lost load, here is the customer risk profile that I mentioned. A high-risk profile refers to a feeder that serves many commercial and industrial customers. Medium risk reflects the typical proportion of residential and non-residential customers in Massachusetts. And a low-risk profile refers to a feeder serving primarily residential customers. You can look at the assumptions for the customer risk profile in more detail in the ICE Calculator Results tab. Returning to the rate impact value streams, this input informs the weighted average calculation. We ask the user to identify the probability of each approach occurring without a bridge-to-wire solution. We expect a diesel generator backup to be a more common solution, followed then by battery energy storage, which is why in this example, I have set it to 90% likelihood of diesel generation and only 10% battery storage. Finally, the bridge-to-wires value based on the user inputs selection is shown here. In this example, the bridge-to-wires value is $118 per kilowatt year based on the weighted average of backup diesel generator and backup energy storage and the medium equipment cost range. Additionally, for the user's benefit, we provide several graphs comparing the different bridge-to-wires values and how the values differ based on cost ranges. This includes a comparison of all the bridge-to-wires values streams and the equipment cost examples for avoided backup diesel generation and avoided backup storage. And finally, we have a graph for the customer risk profiles for the value of lost load. That wraps up the bridge-to-wires calculation. The last value stream calculation tab is to determine the environmental justice value, which is added to the deferral value and bridge-to-wires value if the DER is in an EJ community or if the DER is owned or operated by an EJ participant. A reminder that the EJ values are non-rate impacts, so the decision to include these value streams is ultimately a policy one, and doing so will cause some cost shifts among ratepayers. Understanding the value provided to environmental justice communities from grid services informs how programs can recognize and address disproportionate burdens that EJ communities have experienced within the energy system. As such, we quantified a value here as adders to the rate impact value streams. For the deferral and bridge-to-wire scenarios, we apply an EJ participant adder in the form of a multiplier. The adder is designed to support participation in EJ communities where greater barriers exist to taking part in and receiving direct incentives from these programs. Here we've set it to 20%. For the bridge-to-wires air quality adder specifically, we estimate the air quality impacts that would result from using backup generators if DERs didn't provide flexible capacity. This estimate applies to diesel backup generation and battery storage. For this calculation, the user first selects the diesel emissions factors source to determine which emission factors should be pulled. The EPA reports emission factors for two types of diesel engines: uncontrolled diesel industrial engines and large stationary diesel engines. All of the emissions factors data is included for each of these sources at the bottom of the tab based on the selection here. And you can find those here in the diesel generation emissions factors for uncontrolled diesel industrial emissions and diesel generation emissions factors for large stationary diesel engines. To calculate the air quality impacts of backup generation, both sets of emission factors were run through the EPA's Co-Benefits Risk Assessment, or COBRA tool. The results are also in those sections at the bottom. To align with the rate impact bridge-to-wires diesel backup and battery energy avoided cost calculations, we assume that the solution would be needed for 240 hours. The probability of the backup solution being deployed with DERs is also matched to the bridge-to-wires calculation user input. Based on these inputs, the air quality value for a diesel generator or battery storage are calculated by multiplying the air quality health impacts from COBRA by the hours of usage per year to get a value on a dollar per kilowatt year basis. At the bottom, the weighted air quality impacts is calculated, which is pulled into the compensation calculations in the dashboard tab. The remaining tabs in this workbook, the brown ones, provide supporting materials to the value stream calculations tabs. As I've noted, the ICE calculator results, for example, already, and they can be explored in greater detail by users on their own. Now that I've walked through all the value stream calculations, I'll return us to the dashboard tab to go through the compensation user inputs and calculations. The purpose of the compensation calculations is to combine the outputs from the value stream calculations to determine what the total compensation could look like for DERs. The first input to select is the capacity constraint scenario you are considering, a deferral scenario or a bridge-to-wires scenario. The next set of inputs determine how the compensation will be structured. First, the user determines the EJ customer participation, or what share of capacity is expected to be enrolled to participants designated as EJ customers. The EJ participant adder from the EJ impacts calculation tab will be added to the incentives for these customers. This field can be set to 0 if the user does not wish to reflect any extra payments specific to EJ participants. The localized EJ impact input indicates whether the project location is in an air quality district. If yes is selected and the capacity constraint scenario is set to bridge-to-wires, the air quality adder will be applied. In this case, we've chosen the deferral scenario, so this localized EJ impact adder will not apply. The remaining inputs in this section impact the compensation design. The user can select yes to the reservation payment if you would like the compensation to include a payment for years before the solution's capacity is needed. In this example, I've selected yes. If the reservation payment is selected, yes, then the reservation percent of total value determines how much of the total project valuation should go toward the reservation payment. Next, what year should the reservation payment start? The user should consider how many years in advance of the capacity constraint a payment is needed. Finally, the user inputs an enrollment reserve margin, basically how much extra capacity of DERs should be enrolled over the expected capacity need. This is intended to make sure that during a peak load event, enough DERs are available and can be relied upon to address the need. This wraps up the compensation structure inputs. The next section shows the compensation available for grid services. First, I will focus on the guideline ceiling. which is directly informed by the value stream calculations. And I will then explain the user input compensation, which allows users to override the guideline ceiling. Turning to the guideline ceiling, since we selected a deferral scenario, the total grid services compensation available shows the total deferral value from the deferral value calculation tab and any EJ adder. This value, about 4.2 million in this example, is the upper bound for how much could be spent on grid services offerings without putting upward pressure on rates. A higher value would result in ratepayers paying more to DERs than the benefits they get out in rate impacts. Then the next two rows break out this value and how it should be allocated to EJ participants and non-EJ participants based on the user inputs above. For the value allocated to EJ participants, since I've input that 12% of participation is by EJ customers, this value is 12% of the total value plus the EJ adder value. The remaining value is allocated to all non-EJ participants. Finally, the last two rows show the incentive to non-EJ and EJ participants on a dollar per kilowatt year basis based on the maximum capacity need. Based on the calculated deferral value and the compensation structure inputs, non-EJ participants would receive $132 per kilowatt year, and EJ participants would receive $158 per kilowatt year. In this yellow cell, instead of using the guideline values, the user can override the guideline input with their own baseline incentive that they think is necessary to incentivize DER participation. This input value will then calculate the EJ participant incentive and the above incentive values based on the user entry. In all cases, the user input compensation will flow into the below calculations. So if you'd like to use the guideline ceiling, then set this cell equal to this value in cell C33. In this case, we included a default value at 30% of the guideline ceiling for a baseline incentive of $39 per kilowatt year. This would theoretically reserve 70% of the value from grid services to go to ratepayers, aside from costs associated with setting up and administering the grid services offering. However, as I said, the user can input any value here, though we recommend that this doesn't exceed the guideline incentive. The difference between the user input compensation and the guideline ceiling is the net benefit shared with ratepayers. Compensation that is lower than the avoided costs that we calculated from the value stream calculations will result in savings for ratepayers, though again, this value does not account for program administration or related costs. If this value were negative, it means that there are costs to ratepayers. In our example, by setting the compensation at 30% of the guideline ceiling, it results in almost $3 million in net benefits or ratepayer savings. Finally, this last section for the compensation calculation shows one potential compensation structure based on the user inputs. This calculation is meant to be an example only. It does not reflect the compensation structure for an actual grid services offering. The structure of an actual grid services offering will ultimately be determined by each EDC. This top table shows the discounting index for the payments since the total values are the net present value for the compensation in 2025 dollars. It also shows the years the reservation payments and activation payments are applicable, noting 1 in the cell if the reservation payment or activation payment is applicable. And it shows how much capacity is enrolled each year. A reminder that this is the capacity need plus the enrollment margin. This feeds into the below calculations. The final tables calculate the reservation and activation payments in total dollars and dollar per kilowatt each year for non-EJ participants and EJ participants. In this example, the reservation payment is set to start in 2027, 5 years in advance of the capacity need. Non-EJ participants would receive a reservation payment of $3 per kilowatt year and an activation payment of $66 per kilowatt year. Note that this does not match the baseline incentive that we set above. This is because the compensation issued in individual years varies because of discounting. You can see that the reservation payments are much smaller than the activation payments, resulting our input that they should be 10% of the total value. In the example for the EJ participant, the reservation payment similarly starts in 2027, 5 years in advance of the capacity need. The EJ participants would receive $4 per kilowatt year as a reservation payment. And in 2032, when there is a grid capacity need, the reservation payment would be $79 per kilowatt year. I encourage you to play around with the user inputs to see how it impacts the compensation and to explore the value stream calculations to better understand how DERs provide grid services value. With that, I'll conclude the training for the Valuation Calculator workbook. Thank you.